In the first hours of 1968's Lunar New Year, when families across Vietnam expected a ceasefire and the quiet rituals of Tet, the war broke its own calendar. On the night of January 30th and into January 31st, North Vietnamese forces and the National Liberation Front, often called the Viet Cong, launched the Tet Offensive, a coordinated wave of attacks across South Vietnam that struck cities, provincial capitals, and military bases at a scale few in the South or in the United States had anticipated. For many Vietnamese civilians, it began as confusion. Distant bursts of gunfire where there should have been firecrackers then quickly became the sound of a country ripping open at street level. The strategy behind the offensive was ambitious and risky. Hanoi's leaders and commanders sought to shock the South Vietnamese state, weaken its armed forces, and ignite a political collapse that might bring uprisings in urban areas. They also aimed to change the war's international logic by proving that the conflict was far from being won, despite optimistic statements that had been repeated in 1967 by American and South Vietnamese officials. Tet was chosen not only for its symbolic power, but because it was a moment when many expected reduced fighting. That expectation became part of the weapon. The attacks spread across more than 100 locations. In Saigon, the capital, assault teams struck key targets, among them the airport at Tan Son Nhut, the national radio station, and sites associated with the South Vietnamese government. One of the most famous episodes unfolded at the U.S. Embassy compound, where attackers breached the perimeter and fought for hours before being killed or captured. The embassy was not taken and held as a strategic prize, but the image was enough. A place meant to represent American control and security had been violently entered in the heart of the city. Around the same time, fighting surged in neighborhoods, police stations, and arterial roads, turning the capital into a map of sudden barricades and smoke. Across the country, similar scenes erupted. In the Central Highlands, in the Mekong Delta, and in coastal cities, South Vietnamese forces and their allies scrambled to respond to simultaneous threats. The offensive was not a single battle, but a constellation of battles, each with its own geography and cost. Some attacks were quickly repelled. Others opened days of brutal close combat. The scale forced commanders to shift priorities by the hour, often with incomplete information. In a war already defined by uncertainty, Tet made uncertainty total. In the far northwest of South Vietnam, near the border with Laos, another pressure point was tightening. On January 21, 1968, North Vietnamese forces began the siege of Sanh, surrounding a U.S. Marine base in what many feared could become a decisive set-piece battle. While Sanh was not formally part of the urban attacks, it shaped the wider moment. American leaders watched it closely, wary of a repeat of Dien Bien Phu, the 1954 battle that had ended French colonial rule in Indochina. Sanh drew resources and attention even as cities exploded into combat elsewhere, adding another layer to a month already stretched beyond its limits. No place became more emblematic of Tet's intensity than Hue, the former imperial capital. There, communist forces seized much of the city and held it for weeks, while U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese units fought to retake it street by street. Hue's ancient walls, temples, and neighborhoods became a battlefield of close-range firefights, artillery, and house-to-house clearing. When the city was recaptured in late February, it stood shattered. In the aftermath, mass graves were discovered, and accounts emerged of killings carried out during the occupation. Estimates differ and remain debated, but the event left a deep scar in Vietnamese memory. Hue showed the offensive at its most complex. Military struggle, political terror, and civilian suffering woven into the same streets. Militarily, the Tet Offensive became a paradox. In most places, the attackers failed to hold their objectives for long. South Vietnamese forces, reinforced by U.S. units, eventually regained control of the cities and inflicted devastating losses on Viet Cong infrastructure and personnel. Many historians note that the Viet Cong, in particular, suffered grievously and did not fully recover as a southern guerrilla force in the same way afterward, even as the North Vietnamese army continued to carry the main burden of combat in later years. By traditional measures, territory held, enemy losses inflicted, the United States and South Vietnam could claim a battlefield success. But wars are not decided only by what happens on a map. Tet struck at perception, and perception became strategic reality. For years, American officials had described progress, stability, and an enemy nearing exhaustion. Tet contradicted those claims in one televised week. Journalists and camera crews recorded fighting in streets that many Americans could barely place on a globe, and yet could suddenly recognize by name: Saigon, Hue, the U.S. Embassy. The offensive did not prove that the attackers could win outright in 1968, but it proved they could still reach deep, coordinate widely, and absorb enormous losses to keep the war alive. That was enough to fracture confidence. In the United States, public debate intensified. Trust in official statements eroded, and the political cost of continuing the war rose sharply. On March 31, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and declared he would not seek re-election. Within weeks, the path toward negotiations became more direct. In May 1968, talks opened in Paris between the United States and North Vietnam, beginning a long and difficult process that would drag on for years. Tet did not end the war, but it redirected its momentum, shifting the center of gravity from promises of quick victory to the realities of protracted conflict. In South Vietnam, the consequences were also profound. The fighting destroyed homes and infrastructure and displaced large numbers of civilians. Many urban neighborhoods were damaged by combat, and families who had tried to celebrate a new year instead faced ruins and uncertainty. South Vietnamese forces fought hard during Tet, and the government survived, but the offensive exposed vulnerabilities in security and governance and intensified the struggle for political legitimacy. The war's front line was no longer distant countryside. It had stepped into the living spaces of cities. For the North Vietnamese leadership, Tet was a calculated gamble. The expectation of a broad popular uprising in the South did not materialize in the way some planners had hoped. The losses were staggering. Yet the leadership recognized that the offensive had achieved something vital. It altered the political landscape of the United States and reshaped international understanding of the war. In a conflict where endurance mattered as much as firepower, changing the opponent's will could be as valuable as holding ground. Today, when we speak of the Tet Offensive, we are speaking of more than a campaign. We are speaking of a moment when the war revealed its true scale in the most public places, when the distance between battlefield and home collapsed, and when the meaning of victory became contested in real time. Tet was not a single night, but a shockwave that traveled through February and beyond, through policies, elections, negotiations, and memories that still divide and haunt. And in that sense, the offensive's most lasting legacy may be its clarity. It showed that the Vietnam War could not be measured only by body counts or captured terrain, and that control could be fragile even in capitals. It showed that civilians would carry a terrible share of the burden, and that images could become weapons as powerful as any rifle. On a holiday meant for renewal, the Tet Offensive delivered a different kind of turning point, one written in sudden gunfire, in shattered streets, and in the realization that this war would not end the way many had been told.